In 1776, the 13 American colonies declared they were free and independent. More than 50 years later, the United States was a proud and growing nation. The great American experiment, democracy, was working, and America was a confident player on the world stage. But the promise of America had yet to be fulfilled. To achieve the justice and blessings of liberty promised in the Constitution, the foreboding issue of slavery would have to be resolved. Thomas Jefferson feared it would be the death knell of the Union he helped create. After the contentious election campaign of 1828, which included the first ever political rallies, America readied for a new leader and a new kind of leadership. If anyone ever gloried in the description common man, it was Andrew Jackson, the first self-made man to reach the White House. He was born in poverty of Irish immigrant parents, but enjoyed great success as a frontier lawyer, and at the age of 24 added social recognition to his reputation by marrying Rachel Donaldson from one of Tennessee's most prominent families. 2 years later, the Jacksons were shocked to discover that Rachel's divorce from her first husband was not finalized. At age 45, Jackson assumed command of the Tennessee Volunteers in the War of 1812. They called him Old Hickory because, as his soldiers said, he was as tough as hickory wood. Jackson's stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans restored a sense of pride and confidence throughout the nation. Historian James Shenton.
Jackson's perception of the War of 1812 had two dimensions. One was clearly a war against foreign intervention. The second was the elimination of the Native American presence in the 5 civilized tribes in what is to be the core of the Cotton Kingdom. When he says the best Indian is a dead Indian, he means that. Don't you confuse him with any other aspect of thought.
In 1828, Jackson, under the banner of the Democratic Party, won the presidency after a bitter campaign against President John Quincy Adams. Both sides engaged in personal attacks. Jackson was portrayed as a gambler and murderer who married a bigamist. The transition of power from Adams to Jackson was marked by sharp contrasts in style and philosophy. Adams was one of the most erudite men in the country. He scorned Jackson's lack of education. With his papers riddled with misspellings and bad grammar, Jackson could have been helped by a newly published book, Noah Webster's First American Dictionary of the English Language. On Inauguration Day, thousands of Jackson admirers overwhelmed the Capitol and ransacked the president's house. Jackson's foes were horrified. His supporters said the common man had found a voice in the nation's most powerful office. As president, Jackson demanded personal loyalty. He assembled a kitchen cabinet, an intimate group of personal advisors, and he greatly increased the spoils system, offering government jobs to his political supporters. The test of personal loyalty caused the major crisis of Jackson's first administration. Secretary of War John Eaton married socialite Peggy O'Neill shortly after the death of her first husband. Many found the marriage unbecoming. Cabinet wives ostracized Peggy.
And Jackson was unyielding and unbending, and he made it absolutely clear that he did not give a tinker's damn what these women thought. They were going to accept Peggy. Why? Because Peggy was the living embodiment of his Rachel.
Eventually, the entire cabinet and Vice President John C. Calhoun, Jackson's bitter rival, resigned. While Jackson toiled in Washington, a Virginian named Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper. Once perfected, it would greatly increase farm production. Jackson's administration presided over the violent removal of thousands of Indians to unsettled land west of the Mississippi. The forced exodus of Cherokee Indians from their ancestral home would be recorded in history as the Trail of Tears. Suspicious of privilege and lacking confidence in paper currency, Jackson gutted the powerful Bank of the United States. Opponents ridiculed Jackson as King Andrew, but were unable to dent his popularity or change his policies. Jackson's 2 terms can be seen as a great paradox. He was firmly committed to laissez-faire government and used the veto more than all of his predecessors combined. But his actions actually served to greatly increase the strength of the presidency. Jackson completed his 2nd term and retired to his Tennessee estate, the Hermitage. And while he had embittered many in politics, his popularity with the common man was undiminished. His place in history as a towering figure of the young American nation was secure. When Martin Van Buren reached the Capitol building for his inauguration in 1837, a crowd of 20,000 cheered. But there could be no doubt that the object of the crowd's affection was Van Buren's escort, Old Hickory, the outgoing president, Andrew Jackson. Senator Thomas Hart Benton said it was the only time the rising sun was eclipsed by the setting sun. Born shortly after the end of the Revolutionary War in Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren proudly called himself the first president born under the flag of the United States of America. Curator of the Van Buren home, Michael Henderson.
He decided early on that he wanted to be a politician and worked with political parties in the forming of political parties. And many historians would agree that Van Buren is really the originator of the American Democratic Party and of the 2-party system.
With Jackson's support, Van Buren ran for president in 1836.
And Jackson is Van Buren's political mentor. Jackson allows Van Buren to ride on his coattails. Van Buren has the political will and spirit and knowledge to become president, not necessarily, though, the charisma.
At age 54, the man known as OK for Old Kinderhook became the 8th president of the United States. But all was not okay in the spring of 1837. In his inaugural address, Van Buren warned that slavery was becoming a source of discord and disaster, threatening national unity. And Andrew Jackson's economic policies had led to financial panic. The nation was heading into the worst economic depression in its history. In Massachusetts, educator Mary Lyon broke new ground by establishing Mount Holyoke Seminary, an institute of higher learning for women. Many scoffed. Miss Lyon reassured benefactors, saying educated women would make better wives and homemakers. Discussion over a woman's role in American society was raised to a new level. A firm believer in the Jeffersonian principle of limited government, President Van Buren did little while thousands suffered. A man of refined taste, Van Buren was famous for his elegant lifestyle. With the economy still hurting, resentment toward the president grew, and his re-election bid was doomed. He was a man who built his reputation as a cautious political insider, the great compromiser. But in his final years, he took a spirited and principled stand against slavery. In 1862, the nation was at war against itself. And Martin Van Buren, 8th President of the United States, died peacefully in his bed. A portrait of Andrew Jackson above his head. With the nation's economy struggling, the aristocratic Martin Van Buren became an easy target in the 1840 presidential campaign. William Henry Harrison, the Whig standard-bearer, campaigned as a friend of the poor. Born in a log cabin, the military hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. Buttons, broadsides, and banners sang out the virtues of Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, for Harrison and his running mate, John Tyler. It is often called the first modern campaign. What many did not know was this: Tippecanoe was really born here at Berkeley Plantation, one of Virginia's finest estates. Son of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Harrison enjoyed all the trappings of the Virginia aristocracy, but achieved fame as an Indian fighter and frontier politician. When the Shawnee chief Tecumseh challenged white settlers, Harrison's militia smashed the Indian forces in the Battle of Tippecanoe. It earned Harrison his nickname and lasting fame. In the 1840 campaign, Whig Party strategists focused on style and public relations, not substance. No party platform was drafted. The crafting of a false image of Harrison and relentless attacks on Van Buren brought handsome returns. William Henry Harrison was elected 9th President of the United States. Harrison's victory affirmed the growing importance of the West and frontier life. It was a time when Americans thrilled to tales of the Wild West, and Davy Crockett came to symbolize the legendary daring do of the frontiersman. After his election, Harrison returned from the West to his ancestral home. Writing at this desk at Berkeley Plantation, he drafted his inaugural address, the longest ever. The 68-year-old Harrison, without hat or topcoat, delivered the speech on a wintry day in Washington. It took him almost 2 hours to complete. He developed pneumonia and died only 30 days later. His grand hopes for the presidency reduced to these footnotes in history. He served the shortest term, and he was the first president to die in office. When Vice President John Tyler was notified of William Henry Harrison's death, the issue of who would take charge of the executive office was far from clear. Tyler moved into the White House, firmly staked his claim to the presidency, and asserted full constitutional authority. It was the first and probably most important act of his administration, but it was to be a bumpy ride. Political scientist Richard Pius.
It was tempestuous, it was stormy, it was conflictual, it was every politician's nightmare, probably including Tyler's.
Time after time, Tyler vetoed Whig Party legislation. Cabinet members resigned in protest. Senator Henry Clay and the Whigs were furious and drew up articles of impeachment. Impeachment lacked support. The stalemate continued. Though the government in Washington was spinning its wheels, it was still a time of exciting achievement throughout the land. America was emerging as an industrial nation. The population was over 17 million. Exploration and settlement were expanding by leaps and bounds. John C. Fremont and Kit Carson completed the first scientific expedition of the Rocky Mountains. They planted a flag on Fremont Peak in Wyoming. As the nation expanded, border disputes were also on the rise. After a lengthy debate, a resolution admitting Texas to the Union was passed. President Tyler signed it on March 1, 1845, 2 days before leaving office. Spurned by both parties, Tyler retired to Virginia. He considered himself a political outlaw, and Riley named his estate Sherwood Forest. He enjoyed a quiet retirement, but joined the political fray one last time as the Civil War began. Tyler rejected the Union he had served as president and won election to the Confederate House of Representatives. He died before taking his seat, but his final actions cemented his legacy as one of America's most controversial presidents. In May 1844, a deadlocked Democratic convention turned to the first dark horse candidate in history, James K. Polk of Tennessee. The Whig Party rejoiced. United behind Henry Clay, their derisive campaign slogan became, "Who is James K. Polk?" On Inauguration Day, the Democrats had this reply: "James K. Polk is the 11th President of the United States." Oldest of 10 children, James Knox Polk was born in North Carolina in 1795. Polk became Andrew Jackson's close friend and political ally, and Jackson nurtured his career. As candidate and president, Polk reflected the public's desire to expand the nation's borders and dominate the continent. It was called America's Manifest Destiny.
When he entered the White House, he made a singular announcement. He would only serve for one term. That was a Declaration of Independence.
As a result, President Polk achieved every goal he set for his administration.
The single most successful president in American history in the context of what he said he was going to do was James K. Polk.
Polk's era, the fabulous 40s, was a time of prosperity, expansion, the California gold rush, the golden age of American letters. A prosperous America became a magnet for thousands of Irish, desperate to escape the blight of the potato famine. They flocked to eastern cities where they would face a different blight, poverty, and bigotry. In 1846, the United States and Mexico both claimed possession of a portion of Texas. The dispute was settled by the bloody Mexican War, ending in an American victory. Mexico relinquished its claim on Texas and ceded the huge California territory. The treaty after the war gave the United States 500,000 square miles of new land. The nation's borders now extended to the Pacific. Polk had accomplished his final goal, but critics were quick to note that his agenda failed to address the growing social discord caused by industrialization and immigration. In Seneca Falls, New York, a conference on the plight of women, headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is now seen as the birth of the women's movement. And the nation still seemed hopelessly divided on the issue of slavery. Polk had thrown himself into the presidency as perhaps no one else to that time. He became consumed with every detail of his administration. It took a heavy toll. James Polk died at the age of 53, just 3 months after leaving the White House. Throughout history, Americans have sought out military leaders to serve as president. And no matter how they rank as presidents, the military hero always has a secure place in the American pantheon. Such a man was Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States. Zachary Taylor was born in Virginia, son of a Revolutionary War veteran. As a soldier, they called him Old Rough and Ready, and he led his men into battle riding side saddle on his horse, Old Whitey. Taylor performed brilliantly during the Mexican War, winning a string of battles. The public saw Taylor as the hero of the Mexican War. The Whig Party saw him as a presidential candidate. Presidential historian Henry Graff.
People in America are like people all over the world. They make heroes out of their military victors. And somehow these men have been washed in the blood of the youth. They've been sanctified. If you've been in battle and win, you become fully credentialized as a leader.
Taylor won a close election and became the only president in history who had been a soldier and nothing but a soldier. Slavery, ignored during the campaign, confronted Taylor head-on as he took office. The controversy over extending slavery to newly acquired territory was bitter and growing ever more tense. Though a slaveholder himself, Taylor took a principled stand. He insisted that California enter the Union as a free state. Congressional leaders, led by the respected Henry Clay, sought compromise. Months of debate followed. Some consider it among the greatest and most impassioned debates in our government's history. President Taylor held firm. He rejected all compromise plans, but he would not live to see the end of the debate. On the 4th of July, 1850, Taylor attended ceremonies as the cornerstone was laid at the Washington Monument. It was a blistering, hot day. The 65-year-old president took ill and never recovered. 5 days later, he was dead, just 16 months into his term. The death of Zachary Taylor was sudden and stunning, and it elevated the most obscure figure yet to serve in the nation's highest office, Millard Fillmore of Western New York State. The Whig Party nominated Southerner Zachary Taylor in 1848. To balance the ticket, Fillmore was named as his running mate.
Basically, the real issue with Fillmore is who exactly did he represent? And the probable answer is nobody. He had been chosen in that rather delightful way in which we choose vice presidents, which is not necessarily to believe. We tend not to remember that when we choose a vice president, we may in fact be choosing a president.
When President Taylor died, the rancor over slavery, and to some the fate of the Union, fell to Millard Fillmore. Fillmore put the full weight of the presidency behind compromise on slavery. He saw compromise as the only alternative to war. The Compromise of 1850 was achieved. It admitted California as a free state, allowed other territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, and established a rigid fugitive slave law. The compromise pleased virtually no one. Above all else, the fugitive slave law enraged anti-slavery Northerners. It called for the return of runaway slaves to their owners. During this time, anti-slavery passions were elevated higher still by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most important book of its day. Some entertainment reflected a different side of public tastes. White entertainers with blackened faces toured the country in their uniquely American minstrel shows. Troupes like the Christie Minstrels became immensely popular, but also reinforced negative stereotypes of blacks. Many of Fillmore's goals were not realized during his term, but his ideas represented the confidence of the growing nation. He proposed a transcontinental railway, a Central American canal, a national archive, a Department of Agriculture. Fillmore's support of compromise on slavery sealed his political fate, and he was denied the nomination in 1852. Though retired from politics, he still spoke out against many Lincoln administration policies during the Civil War. Branded a bigot and traitor by his critics, Fillmore lived out his remaining years in Buffalo, and there he died on March 8, 1874. In the 1850s, a doughface was a northern man with southern beliefs. The term was aptly used to describe Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. An ardent Jacksonian, Pierce forged his political career in Old Hickory's mold. He would later be called Young Hickory, a testament to the enduring influence of Andrew Jackson. In 1852, a deadlocked Democratic convention nominated the little-known Pierce for president on the 49th ballot. They were boom times in the West. One San Francisco businessman fashioned new heavyweight trousers for gold prospectors and farmers. The trousers were called jeans. The entrepreneur's name, Levi Strauss. During Pierce's presidency, California gold and new railroads spurred continued settlement in Western territories. The spread of slavery remained the most contentious issue of expansion. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a bill. It would carve 2 new territories out of Indian lands west of the Missouri River. Leaving questions of slavery to settlers, it was called popular sovereignty. President Pierce approved and signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Few laws in American history have had such a profound and devastating impact. Pro- and anti-slavery factions flooded Kansas seeking control. Positions hardened. Violence was at hand. But not limited to Kansas. After delivering an anti-slavery speech, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was beaten senseless on the floor of the United States Senate. Hopes for a peaceful resolution of slavery were nearly gone. Pierce's stand on slavery ruined his chances for a second term and tainted his place in history.
I think that Pierce's administration is generally regarded as one of the worst, precisely because every effort to find some way of confining, restraining, eliminating the issue, which was the issue that would not essentially accept settlement slavery, was demonstrated unworkable in his administration.
In retirement, he reaffirmed his allegiance with Southern slaveholders and harshly criticized Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Widowed, forlorn, increasingly unpopular, he turned to drink and died on October 8, 1869, in Concord, New Hampshire. The furor over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and resentment directed at a wave of immigrants entering the nation led to political upheaval. The two-party system collapsed. The anti-slavery Republican Party was born. Democrat James Buchanan, serving overseas, had taken no public position on the Kansas crisis and so was nominated for president in 1856. Many hoped Buchanan, a man of vast government experience, would save the day. Historian Alan Lichtman.
James Buchanan was in many ways the George Bush of his time, the man who had one of the most impressive resumes in terms of public service. He had been Minister to England, I believe Minister to Russia, Secretary of State, as well as serving in the national legislature. So even though today Buchanan has kind of an obscure image stemming from his role as president, prior to that time, he had compiled a truly distinguished record of public service and was well qualified, at least by his record, to be president.
A young romance ended tragically when Buchanan's fiancée died. He would never marry and remains the only president to have been a lifelong bachelor. In his inaugural address, Buchanan argued that slavery was legal and beyond the reach of the federal government. Edwin Stanton of Ohio warned him, "You are sleeping on a volcano." The Supreme Court bolstered Buchanan's view in the Dred Scott decision when it affirmed the constitutionality of slavery and ruled that slaves were property, not citizens. Bleeding Kansas was the main battleground, virtually a rehearsal for the Civil War. Scores died. Some newspapers said a state of war existed. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid against a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown was convicted and hanged. Passions were aroused. The case crystallized sentiments on both sides. The Union was crumbling, and Buchanan would become a one-term president.
This was a failed administration, but not necessarily the administration that was responsible for the crisis of the Union and the coming of the war. There were big forces operating in America that even a bigger man than Buchanan couldn't have kept under control.
Buchanan took office hoping to quiet the storm over slavery. In his final days in the White House, he said, "I am the last president of the United States." A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. With these words, Abraham Lincoln began his Senate campaign in 1858 and took the first steps of a crusade to save the Union, and some say democracy itself, which Lincoln defined as the last best hope of earth. With his integrity, his simple eloquence, his conviction of purpose, Lincoln is a revered figure. He was born in a log cabin on February 12, 1809. His early years, while humble, were not unusual for a frontier boy. A self-taught lawyer with unfailing integrity, they called him Honest Abe, and he became one of Illinois' leading citizens. In 1858, Lincoln was nominated to run for the U.S. Senate against Stephen Douglas. The candidates engaged in a series of famous debates. They became the focus of the national debate over slavery. Lincoln had become a gifted orator, and he understood the power of words.
Public opinion is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed.
Lincoln's increased stature, along with his reputation as a moderate on slavery, earned him the Republican nomination for president in 1860. With the Democratic Party fractured and 4 candidates running, Lincoln won the election. Southerners regarded Lincoln's victory as the final blow. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina declared the Union dissolved. Secession had begun. When Lincoln left his Springfield home, He described his burden as greater than George Washington's. By Inauguration Day, 7 states had seceded. Lincoln's first speech as president was a plea to preserve the Union. The South was not moved. April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln acted swiftly, stretching the limits of presidential power, believing extraordinary action was needed to make the nation whole.
Lincoln was convinced that the presidency wouldn't be worth having if he didn't have a nation. And I think that Lincoln had a commitment to history. Washington had created this nation, and he was going to scratch his name into history by saving it. And I think that became all important.
When Union soldiers finally engaged Confederates, the early grim casualty figures dispelled any thoughts that the war would be easy, quick, painless. The North had a larger army and navy and a powerful industrial base. 22 million people lived in the North. The 11 Confederate states had only 9 million people, and 3 million of those were slaves. The South did have the advantage of fighting on its home turf, and it also had Robert E. Lee, America's most distinguished military figure. At the beginning, the Union forces in the East met with one defeat after another. But Lee's advance into Maryland was turned back at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the war. Lee retreated, and the Union claimed a major victory. President Lincoln had been cautious on the issue of slavery. After Antietam, the president sensed the time was right and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Since it freed slaves only in the Confederacy, it could not be enforced, but it transformed the nature of the war. It was now a struggle against slavery. Lincoln said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act." Eventually, 200,000 blacks would serve in combat, fighting for the Union, despite resistance from those on their own side. During the war, Lincoln's burden was immense. He endured endless, at times malicious, criticism. His wife Mary escaped her troubles during shopping sprees at New York's finest department stores. Her extravagant binges plunged her into debt to the tune of $27,000. The president's annual salary was only $25,000. Lincoln had forged a 3-part strategy. The blockade of southern ports was largely a success, and the Western campaign under General Ulysses S. Grant had brought a string of victories. But the conflict in the East still belonged to the Confederacy. Then in July 1863, the turning point. 2 huge armies converged on the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 88,000 Northern soldiers faced off against 75,000 Southerners. It was the most important moment of the war, the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. Lee's battered Confederate army retreated. It survived to fight for more than a year, but it was severely weakened. Lincoln honored the fallen soldiers at the dedication of a military cemetery in Gettysburg. His Gettysburg address remains a profound expression of democratic ideals.
From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Lincoln turned to his star in the West. General Grant was named General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Further Union victories assured Lincoln's re-election. With the end of the war at hand, Lincoln was sworn in for his second term. He spoke to the whole nation and to the future.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds.
On April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered. The war was over. More than 600,000 on both sides were dead. The Union had been saved. Less than a week after the surrender, Lincoln and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the performance, an actor named John Wilkes Booth entered the theater. He climbed the steps to the dress circle. Polite theatergoers moved their chairs so Booth could get to the presidential box. There was no guard. Booth opened the door and entered the box. He stood behind Lincoln's rocking chair and shot the president. Booth leaped to the stage. He shouted in Latin the Virginia state motto, "Thus always to tyrants." He then made his escape. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. Unconscious, he was placed in a bed. Through the night, his family and political leaders held a vigil. When he died the next morning, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton broke the silence. Now he belongs to the ages. Blunt and fiercely independent, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee was both a Southern Democrat and a staunch Union man, and so was chosen to balance the ticket in President Lincoln's re-election bid. Ill and braced by alcohol, Johnson's inaugural speech as vice president was slurred and rambling. Tongues wagged. A New York newspaper called Johnson a clown and said, "May God bless and spare Abraham Lincoln." Only 6 weeks later, Johnson became the 17th president. He immediately faced the onerous task of restoring the South to the Union. The South was in shambles. Wounds were still fresh. It was the most critical period of Reconstruction. Johnson favored a mild program of Reconstruction that would be lenient to the new Southern governments.
This was flatly unacceptable to the radicals in Congress, who wanted to put their imprint on the new governments and provide at least basic civil and political rights for the newly freed slave. In the view of Republicans in Congress, Johnson and the Southerners were squandering everything they had fought for in the Civil War.
With veto-proof majorities in Congress, Republicans pushed through civil rights legislation. Then Congress passed a bill requiring Senate approval before the president could fire cabinet members. Ignoring the bill, Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton would not be removed, literally. He locked himself in his office. The crisis came to a head. The House impeached Johnson, but the Senate came one vote short of removing him from office. While Johnson was embroiled in controversy, his Secretary of State, William Seward, was able to negotiate the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Called Seward's Folly at the time, it was truly a bargain at $7 million. With the war over, many turned to more relaxing pastimes. One would become the national pastime. Baseball was fast becoming a mania. In the 1866 championship, the Philadelphia Athletics defeated the Brooklyn Atlantics. Brooklyn fans would have to wait till next year. Johnson left the White House, but was not through with politics. He was elected to the Senate and made an emotional return to the site of his bitter impeachment trial. He was the only president to be impeached and the only man to serve in the Senate following his presidency. When President Lincoln called for volunteers at the beginning of the Civil War, Ulysses Grant, a 39-year-old clerk in a leather goods store, offered his services. A most unlikely choice to be the hero of the war. Ulysses Grant was born in Ohio in 1822. He attended West Point and served as a lieutenant in the Mexican War, but wrote, "A military life had no charms for me." Grant returned home, and as a farmer and businessman, was an utter failure. Later, he accepted a job as clerk in his father's store. And then the Civil War. Grant volunteered.
He's propelled from nowhere to the top of the heap. To understand Ulysses Grant, we have to start with that kind of biography, because we have to see him as somebody who was unsuccessful, who indeed was viewed by everybody and probably by himself as a failure, until the Civil War gives him a chance to become a great general.
Grant's troops swept through Confederate strongholds in the West. He was appointed commander of all Union armies. He spent a year grinding down the armies in Northern Virginia. Grant against Lee, with horrendous casualties. After Lee's surrender and the troubled presidency of Andrew Johnson, the White House was Grant's for the asking. He won a resounding victory and took office amid high expectations. The Grant years were eventful. Booming industry had created what some call the Gilded Age. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. A golden spike secured the last tie. Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone. Bell's new invention was a hit at the United States Centennial Exhibition, a huge display of American industrial might and Yankee ingenuity. Political movements for labor and women's suffrage were gaining strength. Inroads were made, but the suffragettes were largely ridiculed. Some warned that equal rights would create a new breed of cigar-smoking women. But there was a full measure of tragedy, too. Settlement of the Wild West and fierce campaigns by government forces were rapidly shrinking Indian lands. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, captured here in a drawing by Indians who were there, General George Armstrong Custer and his entire 7th Cavalry met their deaths. It was Custer's last stand. And a new group called the Ku Klux Klan terrorized freed slaves and northern carpetbaggers who had flocked to the South after the war. As president, Grant tried to ease tensions between North and South. But corruption engulfed his administration, and events began to spin out of control.
In 1869, he was the wrong man for the job of president. He was an individual who didn't really have any political experience, who didn't have a broad vision of what was needed with respect to public policy in the United States, and who tended to rely on cronies and friendship in the formation of the cabinet. And the cabinet was much more important back in those days than it is today.
Though his integrity was not questioned, growing revelations of corruption and a financial panic which led to a depression tainted his presidency. Before leaving office, Grant apologized to the nation. He said his mistakes were errors of judgment, but not intent. Almost 20 years later, penniless and battling cancer, the ex-president struggled to complete his memoirs to earn money for his family. He finished on July 16, 1885, just 1 week before his death. For over 10 years, confidence in America's highest political office had been shaken. Assassination, impeachment, corruption. Then, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, the electoral process itself would be scandalized in the most disputed election in American history. A congressional commission was appointed to decide the outcome.
Coming in under a cloud, there was a lot of jokes about Rutherford B. Hayes. He was sometimes known as Old 8-7 because of the vote of the commission, 8-7 for him, or by unkind critics as Rutherfraud B. Hayes.
As president, Hayes withdrew federal forces that had occupied the South. It was the formal end of Reconstruction. The era of Jim Crow and segregation had begun. A man of probity, Hayes tried to set a moral tone for the nation. His wife, Lucy, was a temperance supporter who would not serve liquor in the White House.
She's serving non-alcoholic drinks, and they're calling her Lemonade Lucy. I don't think Hayes himself would have gone that far, but he was a moralist. He viewed himself as an ethical person, as an honest person. That's the persona that he presents to the country.
Not all followed the president's example. Gangs of bandits roamed the Wild West. Some became celebrities. When members of the infamous Jesse James gang were captured, a fascinated public bought 50,000 souvenir cards of the desperados in a single month. The Hayes years were marked by dazzling leaps in technology. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, New Jersey, produced two of his greatest inventions. In his laboratory, Edison's team of inventors created the phonograph and the electric light. The lure of success in America was attracting people the world over. By the end of Hayes' term, massive immigration from Europe, and to a much lesser degree from China, would push America's population to 50 million. The immigrants represented diverse cultures and were used as a cheap source of labor. Troubling new issues were emerging: urban squalor, prejudice, workers' rights. When his term ended, Hayes retired to his Spiegel Grove home in Fremont, Ohio. While on a trip, Hayes became gravely ill, but insisted on returning to Fremont. He said, "I would rather die at Spiegel Grove than live anywhere else." 3 days later, he was dead. The 1880 election was one of the narrowest presidential contests in history. Almost 9 million ballots were cast, and the winner was James Garfield, with a margin of less than 7,000. James A. Garfield of Ohio was the last president to be born in a log cabin. Like Presidents Grant and Hayes before him, Garfield rose to the rank of general during the Civil War. But this young general did not thrill in the soldier's life. No blaze of glory, he wrote, could ever make up for the horrors of war. Garfield left the Army to take a seat in Congress. He served for 17 years and would become a Republican leader in the House. At the 1880 Republican Convention, after 35 ballots, Garfield emerged as his party's compromise candidate. He squeaked into office in the general election. With no mandate, Garfield fretted about his term ahead. A struggle in his own party over presidential appointments consumed his attention. And then, just 4 months into his administration, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged man who had been denied a government job. Garfield was gravely injured. Surgeons could not find the bullet. Alexander Graham Bell also failed to find it with an electrical device of his own design. The invention of the X-ray was still 14 years away. Garfield's wife Lucretia won lasting admiration as she kept a vigil for 80 days. On September 19, 1881, James Garfield died, the 4th president to die in office, the 2nd to be assassinated. In the days after President Garfield was shot, nervous attention was focused on Vice President Chester Arthur. To the public, he was a symbol of the spoils system that had corrupted American politics.
And even by the standards of the time, Chester Alan Arthur, as he was known as Boss Arthur or Chet Arthur, was considered to be an absurd possibility as president. Well, as also happens in American history, the presidency changed the man. Arthur was a very vain individual who had a great sense of his own importance, and he decided he was going to really fit the presidential role. And while all his Republican cronies thought this was their time to feast at the federal government, he said no, and essentially locked out the Republican spoilsmen from influence in the White House.
And so the great spoilsman himself became a reformer. Signed into law the Pendleton Act, the first reform of the civil service, establishing a system of merit selection for government employees, and vetoed legislation he felt would lead to waste. In 1883, President Arthur attended the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. Across the river in Manhattan, newly developed iron girders were making construction of skyscrapers possible. Bigger meant better, but not everyone appreciated these new urban giants. To some, the elevator ride alone could be a nightmare. Arthur maintained a rigorous schedule despite a serious kidney ailment. He toured Yellowstone Park and enjoyed frequent fishing trips. As president, Arthur exceeded almost everyone's expectations.
He proved to be not an inspiring president, not an innovative president, but quite surprisingly, an upright and competent president.
Having broken with the political bosses in his own party and in failing health, Arthur did not seek a second term. Republicans, the party of Lincoln and the Union, had dominated American politics since the Civil War. The 1884 election restored the two-party system to national government by sending a Democrat to the White House for the first time in 28 years. Grover Cleveland, a minister's son from New Jersey, became a political reformer. His integrity earned him the nickname Grover the Good, and he was elected governor of New York. In 1884, James G. Blaine, the plumed knight of the Republican Party, was nominated for president, even though he had been implicated in a financial scandal. The Democrats responded by nominating Cleveland, a national symbol of clean government. Blaine was pilloried as corrupt and arrogant. Then Cleveland was accused of fathering a child out of wedlock. He did not refute the charge. It was an outlandish campaign.
The campaign got real dirty as the Republicans began chanting, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" But the Democrats got the last laugh on that when after the election they began to sing, "Gone to the White House, har, har, har." And indeed, Cleveland did win a narrow victory in 1884.
In his inaugural address, Cleveland promised reform, but other issues demanded his attention. Industrial expansion and immigration had created vexing social problems. Immigrants were targets of ethnic violence. Life in urban ghettos shattered the dreams of many of America's newest citizens. But those dreams still existed, and America remained a magnet for people the world over. In October of 1886, a new symbol of the American dream was set in place as President Cleveland unveiled the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. To cure ills unsolved by medicine, Americans were turning to a vast array of cure-alls, billed as home-brewed remedies or Indian cures. The patent medicine industry was booming. One Atlanta pharmacist advertised a new drink as an ideal nerve tonic and stimulant. He called it Coca-Cola. The appalling conditions of industrial workers had given rise to a growing labor movement. Disputes often became violent. Cleveland was perplexed by the labor problem, but still moved ahead with his reform program, establishing the Interstate Commerce Commission.
The Interstate Commerce Commission, under Cleveland in 1887, was the first independent regulatory agency and established the basic practice by which, throughout our history, the American government would deal with the regulation of business. That started under Grover Cleveland and was the notable legislative change of his era.
Cleveland's economic policies would prove his political undoing. He was unseated by Republican Benjamin Harrison. The only president to marry in the White House, Cleveland took his 22-year-old ward, Frances Folsom, as his bride. As the Clevelands prepared to leave the White House in 1889, the popular First Lady told the staff to take care of the home. She said she and the president would be returning in 4 years' time. On March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison was sworn in as our 9th president. On March 4th, 1889, Benjamin Harrison was sworn in as the 23rd president, the only grandson of a president to become a president. Benjamin Harrison was born in Ohio, but made Indiana his home. A tough and disciplined soldier, he rose to the rank of general during the Civil War. He pursued a career in law. Many considered Harrison one of the finest legal minds of his day. The quirks of the Electoral College made Harrison the third man to win the presidency despite receiving fewer votes than his opponent. A champion of veterans, Harrison heartily approved generous pensions for Civil War soldiers and dependents. By midterm, federal spending was approaching $1 billion. Critics cried foul. Yielding to pressure, Harrison opened once protected Indian lands to homesteaders. Hundreds of thousands raced in a mad dash to stake their claims. And U.S. troops battled Sioux Indians, killing chiefs Sitting Bull and Bigfoot. The slaughter of Indians at Wounded Knee symbolized the end of a struggle that had lasted for hundreds of years. The Indians had lost their native lands, and their destiny was now in the hands of the white man. Historian Frederick Turner would later say, "The western frontier is gone, and with it has closed the first period of American history." For some, the frontier lived on in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows. Buffalo Bill became America's favorite entertainer, attracting more than 1 million people in a single tour. For showmanship, perhaps no one could rival P.T. Barnum, whose motto was, "There's a sucker born every minute." Promoter of opera star Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, assorted oddballs, and traveling circuses, Barnum knew modesty was no virtue. He called his circus the greatest show on earth. Two controversial policies during Harrison's term would later be blamed for a devastating financial panic. The Silver Purchase Act and the record-setting McKinley tariff of almost 50% on foreign goods led to high inflation and a run on gold reserves.
Tariff seems like kind of a dull and boring issue today. It was probably the most important issue, though, of the late 1890s, the late 19th century, as the Republicans said, our prosperity hinged on tariffs. Tariffs kept American business afloat by keeping out cheap foreign competition and helped keep wages high for labor.
Harrison shaped a vigorous, activist foreign policy, projecting American power abroad and starting a program to build a two-ocean navy. Economic problems made Harrison vulnerable, and he lost his re-election bid. Defeated, recently widowed, Harrison returned to Indianapolis. He remarried late in life and won renewed respect as a senior statesman. He died at home on March 13, 1901, and was honored with a state funeral. When Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison in 1892, he became the only president to win non-consecutive terms. In the last decade of the century, despite unprecedented industrial growth, most Americans still found work down on the farm. The 1890 census showed farm workers outnumbered job holders in all other industries combined. Statistics also showed it was an uneducated workforce. Only 1 in 400 Americans earned a college degree. In the 1890s, workers faced an uncertain future. As Cleveland took office for the second time, he was confronted with the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. 15,000 businesses would fail. Millions lost their jobs. Many went hungry. In Chicago, President Cleveland sent federal troops to disperse masses of unemployed and striking rail workers led by Eugene Debs. The ensuing chaos was some of the worst domestic violence since the Civil War. Activist Republicans said Cleveland showed little concern for the many who suffered.
In response to the Great Depression, Cleveland did too little, too late, and was unwilling to bend and to try things that might help the ordinary folk who were bearing the brunt of the Depression, which is why the soup kitchens doling out relief were derisively termed Cleveland cafes. We've got to understand the roles of the parties were very different in the Civil War and immediate Civil War period than they are in the 20th century. In this period, the Republicans were the activist party, and the Democrats tended to be the more passive party. And Cleveland is a Democrat of that era. He's not a modern Democrat.
Cleveland left the White House with his popularity at a low ebb. He had been called Grover the Good, but now was deeply hurt that he had lost the confidence of the American people. He retired to Princeton, New Jersey. Over time, his reputation was restored. He died on June 24th, 1908. His last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." It was an era that would be remembered as the gay 90s. But in 1896, the country was reeling from the worst economic calamity in its history. And the Republican Party was returned to power with the election of William McKinley. McKinley was born in Niles, Ohio, served in the Civil War under Rutherford B. Hayes, and became a powerful congressman. In 1896, the economy dominated the election campaign. McKinley faced off against the brilliant orator from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. McKinley won the election and would become beneficiary of a favorable swing in the business cycle as the nation was recovering from the Great Depression of the 1890s.
It wasn't that McKinley had some magic to work on the economy. It rather was that he was fortunate enough to be the right man in the right place at the right time.
With the economy picking up and the frontier settled, a growing middle class pursued the genteel pleasures of the Victorian life. For many, achieving an elegant appearance was a pursuit in itself. Opulence was in vogue. For the Victorian household, too much was better than not enough. When McKinley took office, a revolt against Spanish rule was already underway in Cuba. Many Americans, excited by the prospect of a foreign conquest, wanted to join the fight. McKinley tried to maintain neutrality. But when the U.S. battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, Americans demanded action. McKinley yielded, war was declared, and U.S. troops routed the Spanish in Cuba. Spain agreed to Cuban independence and handed over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. America was becoming a global power.
McKinley was very much of an effective president and knew full well the imperialist direction he was taking the nation with the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 and, of course, the momentous turning point of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War propels the United States in a dramatic way onto the international stage, ending a long period of predominant isolationism.
With a sound economy and Spanish-American War hero Theodore Roosevelt sharing the ticket, McKinley ran for re-election. He won a sweeping victory. In September 1901, President McKinley attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a spectacular display of technology for the new century.
My fellow citizens, this country is in a state of unexampled prosperity. The figures show that we are furnishing profitable employment to the millions of working men throughout the United States.
While greeting guests in a reception line, the president was shot. 8 days later, he died. The third president since the Civil War to be assassinated. The death of any president, an untimely death, is always a reminder of the great importance of the office. Whether weak or strong, the president is still the nation's first citizen. In the 19th century, Andrew Jackson redefined both the presidency and the process of selecting candidates. Starting in the 1830s, party bosses did the choosing. The uniquely American party conventions became the forum.
I guess there's a lot of truth to the old saying, when you leave a convention, you really think this is true, that God takes care of drunks, of little children, and the United States of America. That's the kind of presidents we have in the 19th century. Maybe God took care, because they're not nearly as bad as the bosses that nominated them.
As president, Andrew Jackson presided over 13 million people in 25 states. Under William McKinley, America was a nation of 75 million, poised for a new century. During the span of a single lifetime, America had been transformed. Wrenching political turmoil led to a civil war and an uneasy peace. Breathtaking advances in technology made America an industrial giant. The growing population was enriched by a diversity of cultures. An immigrant once described his feelings upon becoming an American. One moment you belong with your fathers to a million dead yesterdays. The next, you belong with America to a million unborn tomorrows. Especially to immigrants, to the foreign-born, the presidency has always seemed larger than life. Said one on hearing a native-born American criticizing the man in the White House, "Ah, but he is still the president."